The tears streaming down her face seemed to come from nowhere, triggered by nothing more than a burnt biscuit, and the way the morning light fell across her husband's disappointed face. "She cries too easily," Martha Whitmore muttered to her son, loud enough for Julia Bradford to hear from across the general store in Animas Forks, Colorado, where she had fled to escape another one of Thomas's cold silences. It was 1876, and Julia had been married for 3 years to a cattle rancher who treated her like another piece of property, valued only for what she could produce and how little trouble she caused. Julia's hands shook as she pretended to examine a bolt of calico fabric, the tears still wet on her cheeks. She was 22 years old and felt ancient, worn down by the constant weight of disappointing a man who had promised her father he would provide for her after the bank failure that had left the Bradford family destitute. Love had never been part of the arrangement, though Julia had foolishly hoped it might grow. Instead, she had discovered that Thomas Bradford was a man incapable of tenderness, who saw her sensitive nature as a flaw rather than the soft heart it truly was. "Mrs. Bradford, are you quite all right?" The store clerk's voice was kind, but Julia could not bear another moment of public humiliation. "I am perfectly well, thank you," she managed, her voice wavering despite her best efforts. She purchased nothing, simply fled back into the sharp September air, where the aspens were beginning to turn gold against the towering peaks that surrounded this remote mountain town. Animas Forks sat at nearly 11,000 feet, a silver mining community that had sprung up in the San Juan Mountains with wild optimism, and the kind of harsh beauty that could break your heart or mend it, depending on your circumstances. Julia walked quickly toward the edge of town, away from the pitying stares and whispered comments. She had no destination in mind, only the desperate need to be alone with her misery. The road became a trail, and the trail became a path through the pines, and still she walked, her thin shawl inadequate against the altitude's chill but her pride too wounded to turn back. She did not see the man until she nearly collided with him. He was leading a pack mule loaded with furs and stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun filtering through the trees. His hair was dark brown, longer than was fashionable, tied back with a leather cord, and his face was weathered by sun and wind into the kind of rugged handsomeness that came from years of outdoor living. His eyes, startlingly blue against his tanned skin, widened in surprise as Julia stumbled backward with a small cry. "Easy now," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to come from somewhere in his chest. His hands shot out to steady her, and Julia felt the raw strength in his grip even as he held her with surprising gentleness. "You are far from town to be walking alone, madam." The kindness in his tone was her undoing. Fresh tears spilled over, and she felt her face crumple with the shame of it. Here she was, proving Martha Whitmore right, crying in front of a complete stranger in the middle of the wilderness. "I apologize," she gasped, trying to pull away, but he did not release her immediately. "For what?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "For being human." The question was so unexpected that Julia's tears stuttered to a halt. She looked up at him properly for the first time, taking in the concern in those blue eyes, the lack of judgment in his expression. He wore buckskin and wool, clothes made for hard use, and there was a rifle slung across his back, but his face held only genuine worry. "I do not know you," she said, which seemed a foolish thing to point out under the circumstances. "Name is Jacob Wyatt," he offered. "I live up in the high country, trap and hunt mostly. Come down to Animas Forks every few weeks for supplies, and you would be Mrs. Bradford unless I miss my guess. Heard your husband mention his wife when I sold him some venison last spring." Julia felt her heart sink. Of course, he knew Thomas. Everyone knew Thomas, who owned one of the larger ranches in the valley below town. Then you know I should return before I am missed. I know you look like a woman who needs to sit down before she falls down, Jacob said firmly. There is a clearing just ahead with a creek. Let me at least get you some water and make sure you are steady before you head back. Every proper instinct told Julia to refuse, to hurry back to town and face whatever consequences awaited her absence. But something in Jacob Wyatt's weathered face and gentle voice made her nod instead. He guided her to the clearing he had mentioned, a small meadow where the creek ran clear over smooth stones and a fallen log provided a natural bench. Jacob left her sitting there while he retrieved a tin cup from his pack and filled it with cold creek water. When he handed it to her, their fingers brushed and Julia felt a jolt of something she could not name. She drank gratefully, the icy water sharp and clean, tasting of minerals and snow melt. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You are very kind." "Kindness costs nothing," Jacob replied, settling himself on a rock nearby, keeping a respectful distance. "Though it seems to be in short supply sometimes." They sat in silence for a moment, and Julia was surprised to find it was not an uncomfortable one. The creek bubbled over its bed, and a breeze moved through the aspens with a sound like whispered secrets. She could not remember the last time she had felt this peculiar sense of peace. "Martha Whitmore said I cry too easily," Julia heard herself say, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Perhaps she is right. I seem to weep at everything. Burnt food, harsh words, the sight of a sunset, the sound of a sad song. Thomas says it is exhausting to live with someone so emotional." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, and when Julia dared to look at him, she found him studying her with an expression she could not quite read. "Seems to me," he said slowly, "that a person who cries easily might also laugh easily, love easily, feel joy easily. The heart does not choose to feel only the sad things." Julia stared at him, something tight and painful loosening in her chest. No one had ever suggested that her ready tears might be connected to anything positive. Thomas treated her sensitivity like a defect, a weakness to be corrected. Even her own mother had despaired of teaching her to be more reserved, more controlled. "I used to laugh more," she admitted softly, before you married. It was not a question." Julia looked down at her hands, twisted together in her lap. "My father lost everything." Thomas offered security. It seemed ungrateful to expect more. "And now," Jacob's voice was careful, but there was an edge to it, something sharp beneath the gentleness. "Now I have a home and food and everything I was promised," Julia said, the words tasting like ash. "I have no right to complain." Jacob made a sound that might have been disagreement, but when Julia looked up, he had risen to his feet. "I should let you get back before dark," he said. "The mountain gets cold quick this time of year." Julia stood as well, surprised by how much she did not want this strange interlude to end. "Thank you for the water and the rest, Mr. Wyatt." "Jacob," he corrected. "And you are welcome, Mrs. Bradford." "Julia," she found herself saying. "My name is Julia." Something flickered in those blue eyes, warm and bright. "Julia," he repeated, and her name in his deep voice sounded like something precious. "I will walk you back to the edge of town, make sure you get there safe." They walked in silence, Jacob leading his mule with one hand. When the first buildings of Anima's Forks came into view, he stopped. "I hope things get better for you, Julia," he said quietly. "You deserve reasons to smile, not just cry." Then he was gone, disappearing back into the trees like something from a dream. Julia stood for a long moment, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart was beating too fast. Then she turned and walked back into town, back to the small house she shared with Thomas at the edge of the settlement, back to the life she had chosen, or that had chosen her. Thomas was waiting in the parlor, his face set in the hard lines she had come to know so well. He was a handsome man in a cold way, with fair hair and gray eyes and the kind of rigid posture that came from always needing to be right. "Where have you been?" he demanded. "Martha Whitmore said you ran out of the store looking distressed." "I had to hear from her that my own wife was behaving strangely." "I went for a walk," Julia said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I needed some air." "You needed air," Thomas repeated, his tone mocking. "You embarrassed yourself in public and then disappeared for over an hour, and your explanation is that you needed air." "I am sorry," Julia said automatically, the apology worn smooth from overuse. "You are always sorry, Julia, but you never change." The tears, the drama, the constant emotional upheaval. "I have been patient, but my patience is not infinite." Julia wanted to ask what he expected her to change into, what version of herself would finally be acceptable to him, but she had learned that such questions only made things worse. Instead, she went to the kitchen and began preparing supper with shaking hands, her mind replaying every moment of her encounter with Jacob Wyatt. She had never met anyone like him. There was a quietness to his strength, a sureness that had nothing to do with dominating others. He had looked at her tears with compassion rather than contempt, had suggested that her sensitivity might be a gift rather than a curse. The memory of it carried her through a silent dinner, and a long evening of Thomas reading his newspaper while she mended clothes, the two of them existing in the same space without truly sharing it. That night, lying in the darkness beside her sleeping husband, Julia allowed herself to cry silently into her pillow. But for the first time in a long while, the tears were not only from sadness. There was something else mixed in, something fragile and painful and achingly like hope. The next 2 weeks passed in their usual rhythm of small disappointments and careful silences. Julia went about her duties with mechanical efficiency, keeping the house clean, preparing meals that Thomas consumed without comment, speaking only when spoken to. But something had shifted inside her, some small spark that Jacob's words had lit refusing to be entirely extinguished. She found herself watching for him when she went into town, her eyes scanning the streets and the mountains beyond, hoping for a glimpse of that broad-shouldered figure. It was foolish and dangerous, she knew. She was a married woman, and whatever kindness Jacob had shown her had been nothing more than common decency. To imagine it meant anything more was the height of foolishness. But her heart, that traitorous, too tender heart, did not seem to care about foolishness. It was a cold morning in early October when Julia saw Jacob again. She was at the general store, purchasing flour and sugar, when he walked in carrying a stack of beaver pelts. He saw her immediately, and the smile that crossed his face sent warmth flooding through her body. "Julia," he said, nodding respectfully. Then, louder for the benefit of the watching store clerk, "Mrs. Bradford, good to see you looking well." "Mr. Wyatt," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hope the hunting has been good." "Good enough," he replied. "Though winter is coming early this year, I think. The animals know it." They stood there, the mundane words covering the weight of what remained unspoken. Julia was painfully aware of every eye in the store, every ear listening. In a town this small, gossip was currency, and she could not afford to give anyone reason to speculate. But when Jacob moved to the counter to conduct his business, he positioned himself so that his broad back blocked her from view of the clerk for just a moment. In that brief privacy, he leaned closer and said, very quietly, "If you ever need to talk, I check my trap line every morning at first light. The trail we met on before. I will be there if you need a friend." Then he was conducting his business with the clerk, his manner easy and professional, and Julia was left trembling with the audacity of what he had suggested, and the fierce longing it awakened in her. She did not go the next morning, or the morning after that. She told herself it would be improper, that she had no business meeting a man who was not her husband in secret. But the truth was more complicated. She was afraid of what it might mean, afraid of this feeling growing inside her that had nothing to do with Thomas and everything to do with a man who saw her tears as part of her humanity, rather than a flaw to be corrected. On the third morning, she woke before dawn to find Thomas already dressing for an early trip to the lower pastures. "I will be gone until evening," he said without looking at her. "Some fence damage to assess. There is cold roast in the larder for your lunch." Julia nodded, not trusting her voice. She waited until she heard his horse leave, then rose and dressed with trembling hands. She told herself she was just going for a walk, that if she happened to encounter Jacob on the trail it would be pure coincidence. The lie sat heavy in her stomach, but not heavy enough to stop her. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern peaks pink when she reached the trail. The air was sharp and cold, her breath visible in small clouds. She walked slowly, her heart pounding, half hoping and half fearing that he would not be there. But he was. Jacob stood near the same clearing where they had first properly met, and his face when he saw her was like sunrise itself. "You came," he said simply. "I should not have," Julia replied, but she did not turn back. "Probably not," Jacob agreed, "but I am glad you did anyway." They stood looking at each other for a long moment, and Julia felt something pass between them, some acknowledgement of what neither could say aloud. Then Jacob gestured to the fallen log. "Sit with me for a while. I promise I am safe to be around. I just thought you might need someone to talk to who will not judge you for feeling things." So Julia sat, and as the sun climbed higher and painted the autumn aspens gold, she found herself talking in a way she had not talked to anyone in years. She told him about her childhood, about her father's kindness and her mother's worry, about the day the bank had failed, and how she had watched her father age a decade in a single afternoon. She told him about accepting Thomas's proposal, about hoping that duty might transform into affection, about the slow realization that some men were simply not capable of the kind of love she needed. Jacob listened without interrupting, his blue eyes steady on her face, and when she finally fell silent, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "My wife died 4 years back," he said, his voice rough with old grief. "Fever took her and the baby both. Her name was Margaret, and she was the gentlest soul I ever knew. She cried when she was happy, cried when she was sad, cried at beautiful things and tragic things and everything in between. I loved that about her, loved how deeply she felt everything." Julia's throat tightened. "I am so sorry for your loss." "I am too," Jacob said. "Every day. But I wanted you to know that I understand what it means to love someone who feels things strongly. And I wanted you to know that it is not a burden, Julia. It is a gift, even when it hurts." The tears came then, as they always did, but they were different this time. They were grief for Jacob's loss and grief for her own lost hopes and something else too, something that felt almost like healing. Jacob did not try to stop her crying or tell her to compose herself. He simply sat beside her, solid and present, and let her weep until the storm passed. When she could breathe again, she found he had retrieved a handkerchief from his pocket and was offering it to her. "Thank you," she whispered, wiping her face, "for understanding, for not thinking I am weak." "You are the furthest thing from weak," Jacob said firmly. "It takes strength to keep feeling when the world tells you not to. It takes courage to cry when you are taught that tears are shameful." Julia looked at him, this mountain man with the gentle heart, and felt something settle into place inside her. She did not know what would come of these meetings, but she knew she would not stop coming. Not yet. Not while there was still someone in the world who saw her clearly and did not turn away. "I should go," she said reluctantly, "before I am missed." "Same time tomorrow?" Jacob asked quietly. Julia knew she should say no, knew this was already crossing lines that should not be crossed. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was, yes. So began a pattern that would shape the next month of Julia's life. Every morning that Thomas was away, she would slip out in the pre-dawn darkness and walk the trail to where Jacob waited. They never touched beyond the occasional steadying hand or the brush of fingers as he helped her over rough ground. They simply talked, sharing the stories of their lives, learning each other in the way that only happens when two souls recognize something essential in each other. Jacob told her about growing up in Missouri, about learning to trap from his father, about meeting Margaret at a church social, and knowing within a week that he would marry her. He told her about the grief that had driven him deeper into the mountains after her death, about finding a kind of peace in the wilderness that civilization had never offered him. Julia told him about the books she loved to read, about her secret dream of writing stories of her own someday, about the small pleasures that still brought her joy despite everything. The taste of honey, the sound of wind in the pines, the way snow looked on the high peaks in winter. "You should write those stories," Jacob said one morning as they sat watching the sun illuminate the valley below. "You have a way with words, Julia. I can hear it when you talk." "Thomas says creative pursuits are frivolous," Julia replied automatically. Jacob's jaw tightened. "Thomas says a lot of things that I disagree with." It was the closest either of them had come to acknowledging the dangerous territory they were entering. Julia felt her pulse quicken. "You do not know him well enough to judge him." "I know he has a woman like you and treats her like a disappointment," Jacob said, his voice low and intense. "I know he makes you cry and then condemns you for the tears. That is enough for me to know his worth." "I made a vow," Julia whispered. "Before God." "So did he," Jacob countered. "To cherish you. Is he keeping that vow, Julia?" She had no answer for that, or rather, she had an answer she could not bear to speak aloud. They sat in heavy silence until Julia stood abruptly. "I should not come here any more." "You are right," Jacob said, standing as well. "You should not." But the next morning, Julia was there again, and Jacob was waiting, and neither of them pretended any more that this was anything other than what it was. Two lonely people falling in love against all wisdom and propriety. It was Julia who finally said it, on a morning in late October when the first real snow had fallen overnight, and the world was transformed into something magical and strange. "I think I am falling in love with you," she said, the words trembling in the cold air. "And I do not know what to do about it." Jacob looked at her with such longing and sorrow that Julia felt her heart might break. "I have loved you since the day you cried about burning a biscuit, and I realized your heart was too beautiful for the life you are living," he said roughly. "But loving you and being able to do anything about it are different things entirely." "I know," Julia said, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I know." Jacob reached out then, slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she did not, he cupped her face in his hands, his palms warm against her frozen skin. "If you were free," he said softly, "I would court you properly. I would bring you flowers and walk you to church and ask your permission to hold your hand. I would build you a cabin with my own hands, make it warm and safe and filled with everything you needed. I would love you the way you deserve to be loved, Julia. I would give you reasons to cry from joy instead of sorrow." "I wish I were free," Julia whispered, and the truth of it was both beautiful and terrible. They stood like that for a long moment, Jacob's hands on her face, Julia's tears falling freely. Then he bent his head and kissed her forehead, chaste and sweet and full of all the promise of what could never be. "You should tell him you are unhappy," Jacob said quietly. "You should ask him to release you from a marriage that is making you both miserable." "He would never agree," Julia said. "It would be a scandal. His reputation matters more to him than your happiness, and that tells you everything you need to know." Jacob dropped his hands and stepped back. "I will not ask you to do anything dishonorable, Julia. I will not be the reason you break your vows. But I also will not lie and say I do not want you to be free. I want it more than I have wanted anything since Margaret died." Julia wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite her heavy cloak. "What if I talk to him? What if I ask?" "Then at least you will know you tried," Jacob said. "And if he says no, if he refuses to see reason, then you will have to decide what your vows mean compared to your life. But that is your choice to make, Julia. I cannot make it for you." Julia nodded slowly, her mind already turning over how such a conversation might go. She had never directly asked Thomas for anything so large, had never challenged the structure of their marriage. The thought terrified her, but the thought of never seeing Jacob again terrified her more. "I will talk to him," she said finally. "Tonight, when he returns, I will ask him to release me." Jacob's eyes blazed with something fierce and hopeful. "And if he agrees, then I will be at the church on Sunday," Julia said, her voice growing stronger. "And you can ask the Reverend about proper courtship procedures." A smile broke across Jacob's rugged face, transforming it entirely. "Then I will pray that he agrees," he said softly, "and that you find the courage to ask." Julia walked back to town with her heart pounding and her mind racing. She spent the day preparing for Thomas's return, cooking his favorite meal and rehearsing what she would say. When she heard his horse in the yard that evening, she nearly lost her nerve entirely. Thomas came in cold and irritable from a long day in the saddle. He barely acknowledged Julia's greeting, simply went to wash up, and then sat at the table expecting to be served. Julia brought him his dinner with shaking hands, then sat across from him, her own plate untouched. "Thomas," she began, her voice barely steady, "I need to speak with you about something important." He looked up from his meal with annoyance. "Can it not wait until after dinner?" "No," Julia said, surprising them both. "I do not think it can." Thomas set down his fork with deliberate precision. "Very well, speak." Julia took a deep breath, gathering every scrap of courage she possessed. "I am unhappy in this marriage. I have been unhappy for a long time. I think you are unhappy too, though perhaps for different reasons. I would like to ask if you would consider releasing me from our vows so that we might both have the chance to find more compatible partners." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas's face went through several expressions: surprise, anger, and finally a kind of cold calculation that made Julia's blood run cold. "You want a divorce," he said flatly. "I want us both to be free to find happiness," Julia said, trying to keep her voice level. "You deserve a wife who can be what you need, and You deserve what I have given you," Thomas interrupted, his voice sharp. "A home, security, respectability. What more does a woman need?" "Love," Julia said quietly, "kindness, understanding." Thomas laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "And I suppose you have found someone who can offer you these things. Is that what this is about?" Julia hesitated a moment too long, and she saw the answer dawn in Thomas's eyes. "You have," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You have been unfaithful." "No," Julia said quickly. "I have never broken my vows to you, Thomas, but I have met someone who has shown me what it means to be valued for who I am rather than condemned for it. And yes, I have developed feelings for him, but I have not acted on them. I am here, asking you honorably to release me before anything improper occurs." Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "The answer is no. Absolutely not. You are my wife and you will remain my wife." I will not be humiliated by a divorce, will not have all of Anima's forks gossiping about how Thomas Bradford could not keep his wife satisfied. Then, what is the alternative? Julia asked, standing as well. We continue on as we have been, making each other miserable. You will do your duty, Thomas said coldly, and you will cease whatever association you have formed with this other man immediately. If I discover you have continued to see him, I will make sure he regrets it. Do I make myself clear? Fear spiked through Julia, fear not for herself but for Jacob. She knew Thomas well enough to know he did not make idle threats. Perfectly clear, she said quietly. Good. This conversation is over. Thomas returned to his meal as though nothing had happened, and Julia stood frozen, watching her fragile hope crumble to dust. She did not cry that night, though she wanted to. Instead, she lay awake in the darkness, her mind turning over her limited options. She could defy Thomas and continue seeing Jacob, but that would put Jacob at risk and make her the talk of the town. She could submit to Thomas's demands and live out the rest of her days in quiet misery. Or she could leave, simply pack her things and go, though where she would go with no money and no family to take her in. She had no idea. When morning came, Julia rose and dressed with mechanical precision. She knew Jacob would be waiting on the trail, knew she needed to tell him what had happened. The thought of his disappointment was almost more than she could bear, but she owed him honesty at least. He was there as always, his face lighting up when he saw her approach. But the light died when he saw her expression. He said no, Jacob said, not a question. He said no, Julia confirmed, her voice hollow. And he said if I continue to see you, he will make sure you regret it. Jacob's jaw clenched. I am not afraid of Thomas Bradford. You should be, Julia said urgently. He is vindictive when crossed, Jacob. He has friends, influence. He could make trouble for you, maybe even get the sheriff involved in some trumped-up charge. I cannot risk that. So we just stop. Pretend we do not feel what we feel. Jacob's voice was rough with emotion. I do not know what else to do, Julia said, and now the tears came, hot and bitter. I cannot break my vows, I cannot put you in danger, and I cannot live the rest of my life like this. There is no good choice. Jacob pulled her into his arms then, propriety be damned, and Julia let herself be held by him for the first and possibly last time. He was solid and warm and smelled of pine and leather, and she memorized every detail, knowing she might never experience this again. There has to be a way, Jacob said into her hair. There has to be, but neither of them could see it, and eventually Julia pulled away, wiping her eyes. I should go. If someone sees us, I know. Jacob's hands lingered on her arms for a moment before he released her. But Julia, listen to me. This is not over. I will think of something. I will not give up on you. What if there is nothing to think of? Julia asked hopelessly. Then I will wait, Jacob said firmly. However long it takes. If you decide to leave him, if you find another way, if the situation changes, I will wait. I will be here. Julia wanted to tell him not to waste his life waiting for something that might never happen, but the words would not come. Instead, she simply nodded and fled back down the trail, her heart shattering with every step. The next weeks were the darkest Julia had ever known. Thomas watched her like a hawk, noting her every movement, her every absence from the house. She felt like a prisoner in her own life, and the weight of it pressed down on her until she could barely breathe. She cried constantly, and Thomas's irritation with her tears only made them fall harder. It was Martha Whitmore who finally intervened, though not in the way Julia expected. She appeared at Julia's door on a gray November morning, her expression surprisingly gentle. "May I come in, Mrs. Bradford?" she asked. Julia, too surprised to refuse, stepped aside and let her enter. Martha sat in the parlor and studied Julia with shrewd eyes. "You look terrible. if you will forgive my bluntness. I have not been sleeping well, Julia admitted. I would not either if I were trapped in a loveless marriage to a cold man like Thomas Bradford. Martha's words were so unexpected that Julia actually gasped. Oh, do not look so shocked. I have eyes, girl. I have watched you wither away these past years. And I have watched that mountain man, Jacob Wyatt, come to town every week looking like someone kicked his dog, ever since you stopped meeting him on the trail. I do not know what you mean, Julia said weakly. Yes, you do, and before you panic, I have not told anyone else. But I am telling you this. Life is too short to live it in misery. Martha leaned forward, her expression intense. My first husband was like yours, cold, controlling, cared more for appearances than for me. I spent 10 years trying to be what he wanted, and when he died, I felt nothing but relief. I swore I would never make that mistake again, and when I met Joseph Whitmore, I knew he was different. He is a good man, and I love him, and I have never regretted choosing my own happiness. But you were a widow, Julia said. That is different. I am still married. Then become unmarried, Martha said bluntly. Yes, divorce is scandalous. Yes, people will talk, but they will talk for a few months and then move on to the next excitement. You are young, Julia. You have decades ahead of you. Do you really want to spend them all crying into your pillow? Thomas will not agree to a divorce, Julia said. I already asked. Then leave without his agreement. Go somewhere else, start over. You are not required to stay in a situation that is destroying you. With what money? What prospects? Julia felt a hysterical laugh building in her throat. I have no skills, no family, no means of supporting myself. You have Jacob Wyatt, Martha said quietly. A man who clearly loves you and would provide for you. Yes, it would be unconventional. Yes, people would judge you. But you would be alive, Julia. Truly alive, not just existing. Julia stared at this woman who she had thought pitied her, who she had assumed looked down on her weakness. Why are you telling me this? Because I said you cried too easily, and I was wrong. You do not cry too easily. You cry because you are drowning and no one is throwing you a rope. Martha stood, gathering her shawl. Think about what I said, and if you decide to take the leap, know that you will have at least one friend in this town who will not judge you for choosing yourself. After Martha left, Julia sat in the quiet house and felt something shift inside her. The older woman was right. She was drowning, had been drowning for years, and the weight of her vows was the anchor pulling her under. But what Martha was suggesting was radical, frightening, and would mark her as a fallen woman for the rest of her life. Was love worth that price? Julia thought of Jacob's gentle hands and understanding eyes. She thought of the way he listened to her stories and called her sensitive heart a gift instead of a burden. She thought of his promise to wait, to be there if she could find a way. She thought of spending the next 40 or 50 years married to Thomas, growing older and harder and more bitter with each passing season. And she made her choice. It took Julia 2 weeks to plan. She had no money of her own, but she had a few pieces of jewelry her mother had given her that she could sell. She had warm clothes and sturdy boots. She wrote a letter to Thomas explaining her decision, not asking permission but simply stating facts. She was leaving. She would not contest any claim he made on their shared property. She wanted nothing from him but her freedom. On a cold morning in late November, with the first major snow of the season threatening in the heavy gray sky, Julia packed a single bag and walked out of the house she had shared with Thomas for the last time. She left the letter on the kitchen table, weighted down with her wedding ring. Then she walked to the trail. Jacob was not expecting her. It was not their usual meeting time, but Julia had counted on his habits. He checked his trapline every morning, Martha had said, and Julia prayed that was true. She walked until her feet ached and her breath came in gasps from the altitude and the cold, and just when she was beginning to fear she had missed him, she saw his familiar figure ahead on the trail. "Jacob," she called, and he spun around, his eyes widening in shock. "Julia, what are you doing here?" "It is not safe. I left him," Julia said, and the words were both terrifying and liberating. "I wrote him a letter and I left him. I have no money and no plan and nowhere to go, but I could not stay any more. I could not." Jacob closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, searching her face. "Are you sure? Julia, this is not a decision you can unmake." "I am sure," Julia said, and she was. She was terrified and exhilarated and more certain than she had been of anything in years. "You said you would give me raisins for joy instead of tears. I'm here to take you up on that promise if the offer still stands." Jacob's face transformed, wonder and fierce joy chasing across his features. Then he was lifting her off her feet, spinning her around despite the heavy pack on his back, laughing like a man reprieved from execution. "The offer stands," he said, setting her down but keeping his hands on her waist. "It will always stand. But Julia, you need to understand what you are choosing. My cabin is 10 miles from here, deep in the high country. It is isolated and rough and nothing like the comfort you are used to. Winter up there is harsh. You will be cut off from society, from other women, from everything familiar." "Will you be there?" Julia asked simply. "Yes." "Then that is all I need." They started walking, Jacob leading the way on trails only he knew, moving deeper into the mountains as the first snowflakes began to fall. He told her about his cabin as they walked, describing it in detail so she would know what to expect. It was small but well built, with a good stove and plenty of stored food for winter. There was a stream nearby for water, and the hunting was good. He would take care of her, he promised. She would never want for anything he could provide. Julia listened and believed him. More than that, she trusted him in a way she had never trusted Thomas. She knew with bone-deep certainty that Jacob would honor his promises, that his love was the steady, enduring kind that would weather any storm. They reached the cabin just as the snow began to fall in earnest. It was exactly as Jacob had described, small and rough-hewn but sturdy, with smoke already rising from the chimney. "I keep the fire going even when I am out," Jacob explained. "Makes it easier to come back to." Inside, the cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft above. It was sparse but clean, with a table and chairs Jacob had clearly made himself, shelves holding supplies and books, furs piled on the bed for warmth. It smelled of wood smoke and pine, and something in Julia's chest loosened at the sight of it. "It is not much," Jacob said, suddenly uncertain. "It is perfect," Julia said honestly. "It is the first place I have felt safe in 3 years." Jacob set down his pack and turned to face her fully. "Julia, I want to do this right. I know we cannot marry, not legally, not while you are still tied to Thomas. But in my heart, in the eyes of God, I want to make vows to you. I want to promise that I will love you and protect you and cherish you for as long as I live. And I want to hear you promise the same to me, if you are willing." Julia felt tears start to flow, but for the first time in forever, they were happy tears. "I am willing," she whispered. So there, in the small cabin with snow falling outside and firelight dancing on the walls, Jacob and Julia spoke their own vows to each other. There were no witnesses except the mountains and the sky, but the promises felt more real and binding than anything Julia had spoken in a church 3 years before. When the words were said, Jacob cupped Julia's face in his hands and kissed her properly for the first time. It was gentle and reverent and full of restrained passion, and Julia felt herself responding in ways she never had with Thomas. This was what it meant to be cherished, she realized. This was what it felt like when someone loved all of you, including the parts that cried too easily. That night, Julia learned what it meant to be truly loved by a good man. Jacob was patient and tender, taking his time to learn what brought her pleasure, murmuring words of adoration against her skin. And when Julia cried afterward, overwhelmed by the intimacy and the rightness of it, Jacob simply held her and whispered that these were exactly the kind of tears he had promised to give her. Tears of joy, of release, of coming home to herself. The winter that followed was the hardest and happiest of Julia's life. The snow came heavy and steady, cutting them off from the world below. Jacob taught her how to snowshoe and how to read the weather in the sky. He taught her to shoot and to prepare game and to make the most of their limited supplies. Julia learned that she was stronger than she had ever known, capable of enduring cold and isolation and hard work, because she was doing it alongside someone who valued her. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and read aloud to each other from Jacob's small collection of books. Julia told him stories she made up, spinning tales of adventure and romance, and Jacob listened with rapt attention, encouraging her to write them down. He had brought paper and pencils on one of his last trips to town, and now Julia filled page after page with her words, rediscovering a joy she had forgotten existed. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's thoughts and dreams and fears. Jacob told her about Margaret, and Julia was grateful for the love that had taught him how to be gentle. She told him about her childhood and her failed marriage, and Jacob listened without judgment, only compassion. And yes, Julia still cried easily. She cried at beautiful sunsets and at the way the light came through the snow. She cried when Jacob brought her the first spring flowers and when he built her a small desk so she would have a place to write. She cried when she was overwhelmed and when she was happy and sometimes for no reason at all. But Jacob kept his promise. For every tear of sorrow, he gave her 10 reasons for joy. He made her laugh with his dry humor and silly observations. He surprised her with small gifts. A hair ribbon from his last trip to town, a pretty stone from the creek, a carving of a bird he had made during long winter evenings. He held her when she needed to be held and gave her space when she needed solitude. He valued her opinions and asked for her input and treated her as a partner in their shared life. By the time spring came and the snow began to melt, Julia was a different woman than the one who had fled Thomas's house. She was tanned and strong, her hands calloused from work, her eyes bright with purpose. She had written nearly 100 pages of stories, and Jacob insisted they were good enough to be published someday. It was in early April that a visitor appeared at their cabin. Julia saw him coming from a distance and felt fear spike through her. Had Thomas sent someone after them? But as the figure drew closer, she realized it was a stranger, an older man on horseback. Jacob met him at the door, and Julia listened from inside as they talked. The man was a circuit judge who traveled through the mountain communities. He had news from Anima's Forks, news he thought Jacob would want to hear. Thomas Bradford was dead. Julia's knees went weak, and she had to sit down abruptly. The judge explained that Thomas had died in a riding accident, thrown from his horse during a spring storm. He had been found days later. The judge had thought to track down Jacob because there had been talk in town about Thomas's wife running away, and someone had mentioned seeing her heading into the high country. "Mrs. Bradford is here," Jacob acknowledged. "She left her husband because he was cruel to her. She has been under my protection through the winter." The judge studied Jacob thoughtfully, then nodded. "Well, she is a widow now legally. If she wants to return to Anima's Forks and claim any property her husband might have left, she is within her rights." After the judge left, Julia and Jacob sat together in stunned silence. "I do not feel relief," Julia said finally. "I do not feel grief either. I feel nothing for him at all. Does that make me a terrible person? It makes you human, Jacob said gently. He killed whatever feelings you had for him long before he died. You do not owe him your tears, Julia. I do not want his property, Julia said firmly. I do not want anything from that life, but now we can marry, properly, legally, if you still want to. Jacob took her hands in his. I have wanted nothing else since the day you walked up that mountain to find me, but I need you to be sure. Being my wife means staying here in this isolated place. It means being cut off from polite society. Are you truly willing to choose this life? Julia looked around the small cabin that had become her sanctuary. She thought about her writing desk and her growing stack of stories. She thought about the garden they were planning to plant and the life they were building together. She thought about crying from happiness instead of despair, about being loved for exactly who she was. This is already my life, she said simply. I am just asking you to make it official. They married in June in the small church in Anima's Forks. Martha Whitmore stood up as Julia's witness, and the reverend who performed the ceremony asked no uncomfortable questions. A few people attended, and Julia could see the speculation in their eyes, but she found she did not care. Let them talk. She had Jacob's steady presence beside her, and the promise of a future built on mutual love and respect. After the ceremony, they returned to the cabin, to the life they had already been living. Summer was glorious in the high country, with wildflowers painting the meadows and the days long and warm. Jacob took Julia on long walks, showing her the secret places he had discovered in his years in the mountains. They swam in the cold streams and picnicked under the vast sky and made love under the stars. In August, Julia realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She had never been pregnant during her marriage to Thomas, had sometimes wondered if she was capable of it. Now, with Jacob's child growing inside her, she felt the weight of new responsibility. What if I am not a good mother? She asked Jacob one evening, her hand resting on her still flat belly. What if I cry too much and upset the baby? Jacob laughed and pulled her close. Our child will be lucky to have a mother who feels things deeply. You will teach them to be compassionate and kind, to cry when they are sad and laugh when they are happy. You will teach them that emotions are not weaknesses but strengths. You really believe that? Julia asked. I know it, Jacob said firmly, and I will be here every step of the way helping you. We will do this together. The pregnancy was not easy. Julia was sick for weeks, unable to keep much food down, and the isolation of the cabin became more difficult when she was too tired to enjoy the beauty around her. But Jacob was patient and attentive, bringing her whatever she could stomach, rubbing her feet when they swelled, holding her when she cried from the overwhelming nature of it all. As winter approached again, Julia grew large and uncomfortable, but also increasingly excited. They prepared the cabin for the baby's arrival, building a small cradle and stockpiling supplies. Jacob made a trip to town for cloth so Julia could sew tiny clothes, and he returned with news that Martha Whitmore had offered to come stay when Julia's time drew near. Julia wept with gratitude at the thought. Much as she loved Jacob, the prospect of giving birth with only him to help had terrified her. Having another woman present would make all the difference. Martha arrived in early March, just as the first signs of spring were appearing. She took one look at Julia's enormous belly and pronounced that the baby would come any day. She was right. 2 days after her arrival, Julia's labor began. It was long and painful and exhausting, and Julia cried through most of it, but Martha and Jacob were there, supporting her, encouraging her, reminding her that she was strong enough to do this. And finally, After 18 hours of labor, Julia's son was born, small and perfect and wailing at the top of his lungs. "He has your spirit," Jacob said, tears streaming down his face as he held his son for the first time. Listen to him make his feelings known. They named him Daniel after Julia's father. He was a good baby, healthy and strong, and Julia fell in love with him instantly. Motherhood was harder than she had imagined, the constant demands exhausting, but it was also more rewarding. Every smile, every small milestone, filled her with a joy so intense it brought tears to her eyes. "There she goes, crying again," Jacob would tease gently when he found her weeping over some small moment of beauty or connection with their son. "You promised me reasons for joy," Julia would reply. "This is your fault." As Daniel grew, Julia discovered that she was a better mother than she had feared. Her sensitivity made her attuned to her son's needs, able to sense when he was uncomfortable or scared or simply needed to be held. And Jacob was right. Their son learned from her that feelings were natural and acceptable. He cried when he was hurt and laughed when he was happy, and neither parent ever made him feel ashamed of his emotions. When Daniel was 2, Julia discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their daughter was born the following spring, a calm and observant baby they named Emily after Jacob's mother. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and small joys. Julia continued to write, filling journal after journal with her stories. When Daniel was 5, Jacob made the long journey to Denver and returned with a published copy of Julia's first book. A publisher there had been willing to take a chance on her work, and seeing her words in print made Julia cry so hard that Jacob had to hold her for an hour until she could calm down enough to read it. The book sold modestly, but well enough that the publisher wanted more. Julia's Stories of the West, written from a woman's perspective with emotional honesty and vivid detail, found an audience hungry for something different from the typical adventure tales. She would never be rich from her writing, but the extra income helped, and more importantly, it gave Julia a sense of accomplishment beyond her roles as wife and mother. As the children grew older, Julia and Jacob faced the question of schooling. They were too isolated for the children to attend regular school, so Julia taught them herself, using books Jacob brought from town and her own creativity. She taught them to read and write, to cipher numbers and understand history. Jacob taught them to live in the wilderness, to track and hunt and respect the natural world. When Daniel turned 10, he asked about his grandparents. Julia told him about her father, the kind man who had suffered financial ruin and died of a broken heart 2 years into Julia's marriage to Thomas. She told him about her mother, who had remarried and moved to California, and with whom Julia exchanged occasional letters but had not seen since before he was born. "What about your first husband?" Daniel asked. "The one before Papa Jacob," Julia chose her words carefully. "I was married once before, to a man who was not kind to me. When I left him and found your father, I found what real love was supposed to look like. That is why I named you after my own father, because he was one of the few men I knew who understood that strength includes gentleness." Daniel seemed satisfied with this answer, and as he grew older, Julia told him more, wanting him to understand that sometimes the right choice is the hard one, that sometimes love requires courage. Emily was different from her brother, more reserved and thoughtful, but she had inherited Julia's sensitive heart. She cried easily too, and Julia held her daughter and told her it was a gift, not a curse, to feel things so deeply. The years turned into decades. Julia's hair began to show silver, and Jacob's strong body showed the wear of hard living, but their love never wavered. They still sat by the fire in the evenings, still talked about everything and nothing. They still made each other laugh and held each other when tears came. When Julia was 45, Martha Whitmore died, and Julia traveled to Animas Forks for the funeral. It was strange to walk the streets of the town she had fled nearly 20 years before. Some people remembered her and whispered, but most of the old gossips were gone or had moved on. The town itself had changed, growing larger as mining expanded. Julia stood at Martha's grave and wept for the woman who had given her the courage to choose herself. "Thank you," she whispered to the earth. "Thank you for the rope when I was drowning." Back at the cabin, Julia threw herself into her writing with renewed energy, wanting to capture the stories of women like Martha, women who had lived with courage and conviction. Her books grew more popular, and she began to receive letters from readers thanking her for writing about emotions honestly, for creating characters who cried and loved and felt things deeply without apology. Daniel grew into a young man much like his father, strong, capable, and gentle-hearted. At 20, he married a girl from one of the nearby ranches, and Julia gained a daughter-in-law she adored. Emily proved to have a gift for drawing and painting, capturing the beauty of the mountains in ways that took Julia's breath away. When Julia turned 50, Jacob organized a party, inviting their children and grandchildren, for Daniel and his wife had given them 2 grandsons. They gathered in the cabin that had been Julia and Jacob's sanctuary for so many years, and Julia looked around at the faces of the people she loved and cried happy tears. "Still crying too easily, Mama," Emily teased gently. "Always," Julia said, laughing through her tears. "Your father promised me reasons for joy, and he has spent 30 years keeping that promise." Jacob pulled her close, his hair now more silver than brown, his face lined but still handsome to her eyes. "And I will keep it for 30 more," he murmured, "for as long as we have." They had another 20 years together, years of watching their grandchildren grow, of seeing Emily marry and have children of her own, of Julia's books continuing to find new readers. They had years of quiet evenings and loud family gatherings, of laughter and tears and everything in between. Jacob died on a summer morning when he was 78, peacefully in his sleep with Julia beside him. She woke to find him gone, and the grief was devastating, a tearing pain that felt like it might destroy her. She cried for days, weeks, the tears an endless river of sorrow. But even in her grief, Julia recognized the gift she had been given. 50 years with a man who had loved her completely, who had valued her sensitivity and never made her feel ashamed of her tears. 50 years of being cherished and protected and encouraged to be fully herself. She lived another 5 years after Jacob's death, years filled with her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She continued to write almost until the end, her stories now infused with the wisdom of a long life well lived. When she died at the age of 75, surrounded by family in the cabin she and Jacob had shared, her last words were simple. "I am ready to see him again," she whispered. "Tell my stories. Tell them that it is all right to cry, that emotions are not weaknesses but the very thing that makes us human. Tell them what real love looks like." Emily, now a woman of 50 herself, held her mother's hand and promised she would. And she kept that promise, publishing a collection of Julia's stories and journals that became her most popular work yet. The book was titled Reasons for Joy, The Life and Words of Julia Wyatt, and in the introduction, Emily wrote about her parents' love story. She wrote about a woman who cried too easily and a mountain man who promised to give her reasons for joy instead. She wrote about the courage it took to choose love over duty, happiness over respectability. She wrote about how her mother had taught her that sensitivity was strength, that tears were natural, that feeling things deeply, was a gift to be treasured. And she wrote about how her father had kept his promise every day of their 50 years together, creating a life so full of love and laughter and small, beautiful moments that Julia's tears of sorrow had been far outnumbered by her tears of joy. The book became Julia's legacy, read by generations of women who needed to hear that their emotions were valid, that they deserved to be loved for exactly who they were. And in the high country of Colorado, in the San Juan Mountains, where aspens still turned gold every autumn, the cabin where Julia and Jacob had built their life together stood for many more years, a testament to the truth that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is choose to be happy, even when the world says they should not. Julia's descendants kept the cabin maintained, and it became a gathering place for the family, a reminder of where they had come from. And every year on the anniversary of Julia and Jacob's wedding, the family would gather there and someone would read from Julia's journals, sharing her words about love and courage and the beauty of a sensitive heart. They would read about the day she walked up a mountain to find a man who had promised her reasons for joy, and how he had spent the rest of his life keeping that promise. They would read about tears cried from happiness instead of sorrow, about laughter shared and children raised and a love that had endured every hardship. And every year, someone would cry while listening because Julia's words had a way of touching the deepest places in the heart. And every year, someone would remember that crying was not weakness but humanity, and that the right person would love you for your tears instead of condemning you for them. That was Julia's gift to the world, the understanding that sensitivity and strength were not opposites but partners, that a heart that cried easily was a heart that loved deeply, and that real love gave you reasons for joy instead of reasons for sorrow. It was a gift she had learned from a mountain man who saw her crying over a burnt biscuit and recognized not weakness but a beautiful soul in need of kindness. And it was a gift she passed down through generations, a legacy more valuable than any material inheritance. The knowledge that you deserve to be loved exactly as you are, tears and all.